We're really excited. We're going to be talking about climate change as well as global warming, and we're going to be connecting that to health. So I know a lot of times we think of kind of the environment and our human bodies as sort of separate topics. So it's really exciting to be able to figure out how they interact with one another. And we're also really excited to have our guest speaker, Dr. Caleb Dresser, who is an emergency medicine physician. So he works in the emergency room, and he's also a climate and human health fellow. So he's going to be talking about his interest in both like climate change as well as human health. So we're going to learn a lot about kind of COVID-19 as well as the environment from him.
Okay, great. So to start out this session, we're going to teleport ourselves to the Arctic Circle. Imagine we're in Russia, where Katara's water tribe is, for everyone there who watches Avatar. So on the left is where I want everyone to picture themselves being. So we're in the cold, we're in the tundra. And it's 2016, and we're a team of epidemiologists who have been called to investigate something weird that's been going on. So after a very, very hot summer, with temperatures up to 90 degrees, which is practically unheard of in the Arctic, some reindeer start to die mysteriously. And a few weeks pass, and thousands and thousands of reindeer end up dying. There's bodies everywhere. I didn't want to put a picture here because that would be too scary and gruesome. But does anyone have any guesses as to what's going on with the reindeer, just at the top of their head? You can type it in the chat.
There's a pathogen going through their species.
Okay, so there's a pathogen. What else? So some people are guessing a disease.
Yeah, so I just got late, so what's happening?
Oh, so today we're talking about climate change and disease and COVID-19. So we just started, so you didn't miss out on much.
So actually, I think it's happening to the deers. It's either extreme climate change, which is unlikely, or severe disease caused because of the lowering temperatures allowing the disease to thrive.
Okay, so you guys are on the right track. Better than the Russian epidemiologists back then, for sure. They thought the deer were starving. They thought the summer was too hot and the reindeer couldn't adapt to the temperatures. But a few months passed and humans started getting sick. So a 12-year-old boy actually ended up dying, and dozens of people had to go to the hospital because they were coughing, they had issues with their lungs. And finally, after conducting an autopsy, the epidemiologists figure out that the culprit is, next slide please.
Coronavirus?
Not coronavirus, but it's a different bacterial disease called anthrax.
Oh, anthrax.
So this is anthrax right here. So if you've never heard of anthrax before, it's a bacterial disease that attacks your lungs, and it can spread through these small, they're not exactly cells, but they're called spores. So you can think of them as the seeds of the bacteria. And these spores can drift through the wind, and if they land or if they enter an organism's body, then they can cause anthrax to infect that animal or that person. So what ended up happening was, because it was so hot this summer, that the ground and the ice in the tundra started to melt. And as the ice started melting in the ground, a reindeer that died 76 years ago from anthrax was uncovered, and it was exposed to the air, it was exposed to the sun. And because that reindeer had so many anthrax spores in it from 76 years ago, these spores just started floating in the air, and they've infected 2,000 reindeer, they infected dozens of people, and this infection got so bad that everyone in this part of Russia had to be airlifted out, and over 250,000 reindeer had to be killed by the government to try to contain the disease from spreading. So I'm seeing right now there's some questions in the chat right now. So yes, this actually did happen, and it still happens occasionally today, where diseases come out of the tundra and then infect reindeer and kill thousands of them. And some people are saying, do mushrooms have spores? Yep, mushrooms also release spores, and anthrax is a very special pathogen, where similar to a mushroom, it can release spores that can cause diseases. So it's super, super scary, and we just thought this would be a really interesting way to introduce the topic that your health and climate change are tied together, and we don't want you to think of these as very separate issues. And one more question before we move on. So Rithwick asked, was the disease active 76 years ago before today or before the outbreak? So 76 years ago, a reindeer with anthrax walked into the tundra, then it died, and the reindeer's body, along with the bacteria, was frozen in the ice. So while the bacteria was frozen in the ice, I would say it was dormant. And then only in 2016 did the reindeer become exposed to the air, and then the bacteria began to thrive again. So yeah, bacteria can survive for a very long time in cold temperatures.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that, Ryan. So just like Ryan said, we really want to talk about how climate change and human health is really kind of overlaps and they affect one another. But before we did that, we thought it would be really helpful to do a review about climate change and global warming in general. I'm sure all of you have heard about this. If you have heard about the words global warming or climate change in your science classes or just kind of on the news, I want you to do like a thumbs up or like a raise your hand or like a yes, anything that lets us kind of see what people's experiences are. I'm seeing a lot of like thumbs up, like clap emojis. Perfect. Yes. So instead of us kind of teaching it to you, we really want this to be a guided discussion. So does anyone maybe want to explain what their understanding of global warming or climate change is? You can unmute yourself or.
Okay, so basically global warming is when the ozone layer gets thicker. The ozone layer is basically a bunch of gas, and when heat hits, the ozone layer goes through, but when it tries to escape from Earth, it gets blocked, so it's like a blanket. And as humans pollute more from things like factories and smoking and causing like factories and burning wood and chopping down trees and burping cows, well, global warming or the ozone layer gets worse and worse until finally people realize that it's very serious.
Yeah, so somewhat on the right track, Andrew. Thank you for that. Does anybody else want to add anything to what Andrew said? Any more thoughts?
Can I?
Yeah.
So the ozone layer is basically, what it does is it traps heat, and then the heat that it traps basically heats up the earth. So when we pollute like carbon dioxide into the air, the carbon dioxide also attracts heat. So when we pollute carbon dioxide, it makes the earth warmer, hence the term global warming. So if we pollute more like from factories and other forms of like carbon dioxide emissions, then we increase carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and heat the earth.
Yeah, exactly. Those answers are perfect. So basically the way we can think of global warming is just that our Earth has an atmosphere, and when we release harmful gases, also known as greenhouse gases, these gases trap heat. And the way I like to think about it is imagine the Earth is an oven, and these greenhouse gases are basically shutting the oven, meaning that there's no way for heat to escape. And it just makes sure that the Earth just keeps continuously becoming warmer. So I know we talked about one greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide, but does anyone know what are some other greenhouse gases?
Methane. It's actually worse.
Yeah, methane or CH4 is another greenhouse gas. Nitrates, exactly. Those are some examples of, there's nitrous oxide. There are a lot of other greenhouse gases in addition to carbon dioxide is the one that we most commonly hear about. So then, kind of, now that we understand sort of what these greenhouse gases are and examples of them, and we know that they basically just increase the overall temperature of Earth by trapping the heat, I want us to kind of think for a couple of seconds, why is it bad when Earth's temperature is increasing? Like, why is that a bad thing? And I know Ryan mentioned an example of some infectious agents being released from permafrost, but what are some other examples? You can feel free to type it in the chat or, just unmute yourself.
Honestly, I think that the ecosystem would collapse. Crop failures, ocean risings, and just being unbearable to live. Like, imagine living in a world where it's 3 degrees hotter. When I say 3 degrees, I mean like not Fahrenheit, but Celsius.
Yeah, exactly. And everyone, I love the answers in the chat, so keep them up. I can see we have crop failures, ice melting, and when we've got ice melting, we've got infectious agents coming out, but we also see that sea levels rise. And one thing that's really bad about sea level rise that we don't even really think of is we have people called climate refugees, where they live in certain parts of the world where they're more vulnerable, so their homes can be wiped out because of sea level rise. So then they have to move, and they basically are displaced from their homes. And that's a huge issue that we've been noticing that sometimes people don't really pay as much attention to. So I'm glad we brought that up. We see there's lots of animals in the Arctic and the Antarctic losing their habitats. That's also a really great example. And that kind of links to this idea of an ecosystem collapse. Because if we have some animals that are becoming extinct, that means the animals that eat them or rely on them also become extinct. It's a huge snowball effect. Floods, droughts, places get flooded. Exactly. These are some great answers. So that's exactly it. And some other things that we didn't talk about in general, things like natural disasters. So forest fires, hurricanes, typhoons, all of those become more intensified because when we have warmer weather, it means there's a lot more energy for these natural disasters to feed off of. So those are great answers. Before we kind of go into how climate change affects human health, does anyone have any questions? Anything they want us to clarify? Okay, great. So just so you can kind of understand, piecing together what everyone's answers were, climate change overall is when you have the sun's energy kind of entering the Earth's surface and the Earth's atmosphere, but instead of being released back, what we see is that we have these greenhouse gases that are trapping kind of the energy into the Earth's atmosphere, making it a lot warmer. And these are some examples of kind of where a lot of these greenhouse gases come from. So now out of curiosity, kind of going on to this topic about climate change and human health, how do you think they're connected? What are some guesses that people have?
Well, I guess that as it grows warmer, some bacteria can thrive more, as well as mosquitoes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, those are some great.
Transmit more disease. Do you know mosquitoes is the #1 killer besides humans?
Yeah, exactly.
It will cause more diseases.
Yeah, exactly.
Wildfire.
Great job, Andrew. So those are definitely some really good examples of how the environment is really connected towards kind of our human health. And the best way to think about it is just the fact that you can't have healthy people living in a dying planet. That doesn't work. In order for us to be healthy, we need our planet to also be super healthy. So one of the things we're going to talk about is air quality. So actually on this topic of ozone, there are two different types of ozone. So as you can kind of see in this diagram, we have a protective ozone layer that's good, and that's in our stratosphere. But then we have a really dangerous ozone layer that's kind of at the ground level where we breathe. And ozone that's happening at the ground level where we breathe is really, really dangerous for us. And it's basically caused when we have these different kind of greenhouse gases combined, and then it creates this ozone. And the reason why it's bad is it hurts our lungs. It makes it really hard for people with asthma to breathe, which is why, and it's also one of the biggest contributors to smog. So that's why you see in a lot of big cities, because there's so much pollution, we have smog and we have ozone kind of at the ground layer. So a really bad air quality is also associated with climate change. That's really bad for people who suffer from kind of respiratory diseases or have trouble breathing anyway. It kind of aggravates that. And then another thing that's also something that's super important that we don't think about all the time is if you live in California, for example, you know that forest fires and wildfires are a huge problem over here. And that's been intensified over the past couple of years because of climate change. These warmer temperatures mean that kind of forest fires happen more commonly. And because of that, oftentimes things like smoke also is linked to things like heart disease, cancer. So those are some examples of how kind of air quality and how air quality associated with the environment can hurt us as human beings. And the next thing we want to talk about, and some of you already mentioned this, so y'all did a great job kind of just predicting what we were going to say, but it's the fact that kind of food security, food quality goes down and food yield goes down. So just kind of to explain this idea, what happens when we have warmer temperatures, basically plants lose a lot of their moisture to the environment. So they lose a lot of their water, which means that crop yield usually goes down. And when crop yield goes down, what does that mean? Why is it bad that crop yield goes down? Or what does yield even mean? Does anyone
have a question?
Oh yes, Samahit, what's up?
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
You know how water, like, I think it's called transpiration or something, where it gives off like water, right? Mm-hmm. So instead of that, can't they use that water Like, you know how you said that it that it gives off, so technically isn't that okay?
So the problem is that the water that they're ultimately taking in through their roots is then lost to the environment a lot more frequently. So they're not able to keep the water is the problem. And they need water to be able to create food, to like create the glucose molecules for themselves through photosynthesis. So that's kind of the problem with why they're not able to keep the water when it's warm, if that makes sense.
Oh, okay, I got it.
Cool. Good question. But yeah, that's one of the problems that we have because food yield goes down. And I know, Sean, what are we talking about? We're basically just talking about how the environment directly affects kind of the way we live every day, and it affects our human health. So out of curiosity, I want you to take a couple of seconds to kind of just understand what this graph looks like, and we're going to talk about it. But basically, the overall discussion we're trying to have, Sean, just to kind of recap, is when we have warmer temperatures, it means that there are less amount of crops that are being made, so our yield decreases. And that's really bad because that means we're not able to feed as many people. So things like starvation, malnutrition, that becomes a huge problem. So can someone, after kind of looking at this diagram, sort of explain what's going on? Or does someone want to digest this diagram for us? Maybe someone who hasn't spoken as much today? Or anyone can jump in, but I'll give you a clue. So on the left, we have how does food yield change when we have a 2 degrees Celsius increase in temperature? And then how does food yield change when there's a 4 degrees Celsius change in temperature? And on the bottom, this is basically the scale for what food yield looks like. So green shows that the amount of food is increasing. The purple shows that the amount of food is decreasing. So with that, does anybody kind of want to take a guess? Yeah, Ali, do you want to take a guess?
The food is decreasing?
Yeah, so basically when we have an increased temperature, so as you can see when we go from 2 degrees Celsius to 4 degrees Celsius, what happens is that it becomes darker. Do people notice that? Like overall, we can see that kind of the yield becomes a little bit darker, a darker purple. And that means that when it gets warmer, we have a decrease in the amount of food that's being produced. And that's really, really bad because it means that people who are food insecure or don't have access to food, that hurts them even harder. So basically, the really short answer is warmer temperature and climate change means there's less food for us to eat, which makes it harder for people who are already lacking nutrition.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about 2 more reasons. So we mentioned this at the beginning of the session, which is basically diseases trapped in the ice. So we're going to delve into that a little more to explain what exactly is going on. So has anyone ever heard of permafrost? Type in the chat if you have. Yeah? So permafrost is essentially soil in the tundra or in the Antarctic that's constantly frozen. So what happens in these very, very cold places is when plants or animals die, their bodies don't decompose. Instead, because snow and rocks are piled on top of the plants and the animals, and the weather is so cold, they just stay frozen for hundreds and hundreds of years. But climate change is changing that. So you can think of permafrost as nature's refrigerator. And essentially what climate change is doing is it's opening up the refrigerator and letting the permafrost melt and letting these dead bodies be exposed to the air, which sounds super gross, but yeah, it's kind of dangerous. So in Alaska, for example, Spanish flu, they found traces of Spanish flu in Alaska because humans that were buried there, their bodies were exposed after the ice covering the bodies melted. And in Siberia, they found traces of the bubonic plague and smallpox. And it sounds crazy that these microorganisms can just survive the ice and then infect humans again. But this has happened before where scientists in Antarctica were able to revive a virus that was trapped in the ice for 8 million years. So ice can preserve viruses and bacteria for a very, very long time, which is why if all this ice melts and these bacteria and viruses are able to infect humans again, it would be very dangerous because if we haven't been exposed to these different types of pathogens before, then we might not have the ability to respond to them effectively. So a super disease could be living in the ice right now for all we know, and that's something that we have to prepare for if we don't do anything about it. Yeah. So the next reason here is, I think Andrew might have mentioned this before, but a lot of the insects that carry diseases like ticks and mosquitoes, they like the heat. So we usually associate mosquitoes with living in the tropics, but because temperatures are rising, mosquitoes can now live in places that they couldn't live in before. And the second thing is that when temperatures rise, mosquitoes also get hungrier. So you can see how in the summer, people are often covered with mosquito bites. And each time someone is bit by a tick or a mosquito, that's just a chance for a disease like malaria to spread. So if you look at this GIF or GIF, I'm not sure how exactly everyone pronounces it, you can see that if the climate continues to warm up by 2080, you can see that mosquitoes are able to live in many more places. So the colors on the maps represent how long mosquitoes can live in a certain place. So red means that mosquitoes can survive there the whole year, whereas blue means that they can survive there for a lesser amount of time. But the general trend here is that mosquitoes will be spreading their range, which means they have a greater chance of infecting humans with disease. Yeah, so before I hand it off to Isha again, does anyone have any questions about everything we talked about so far? No? Okay.
Okay, perfect. Well, we're really, really excited to have Dr. Caleb Dresser here to talk about the kind of intersection more between COVID-19 and climate change. We know that all of you are experts, hopefully now, in terms of the environment and human health in general. So can everyone give Dr. Dresser a warm welcome?
Hello.
Thank you. Hello, good to see you all.
Hi.
Nice to see you, Ellie. So good to see everyone this evening. I want to say thank you to Isha and Ryan and everyone at Stemnova for having me here to speak. And I want to say thank you to all of you who are listening to this either now or in the future as it's recorded, for taking some interest in what's going on our planet and what's going on in the lives of a lot of people around you. A little bit of background about me. I am a practicing emergency room doctor based in Boston. I have been working clinically throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, and both practicing in the emergency department I work in Boston, and also volunteering at one of the field hospitals that was set up in a convention center in Boston for a couple of months in the springtime during the first surge of cases we had here in Massachusetts. So I've been very up close and personal with what's going on clinically with some of the things in the pandemic, and we can certainly talk about that and I can answer questions about it. But I want to, during this brief chat that we get together, spend a little bit of time connecting this with some of my other work, which is much more focused on climate change. I'm also doing a fellowship right now with a group at Harvard that works on the intersection between climate change and human health, which it sounds like you were just hearing a little bit about when I joined here. That was a great map. And so there are a lot of connections to talk about here. A couple of things I want to highlight. We're going to talk about how solutions to the COVID-19 pandemic and to preventing future pandemics are in many ways aligned with solutions that can prevent or address the impacts of climate change. We're going to take a little bit of time to talk about who's at risk from these things. They are a threat to everyone, but they are not a threat equally. And some populations and some individuals are at particular risk. And there's some overlap between both climate change and COVID-19 in who's affected. And we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about climate-related disasters and how these can interact with COVID-19. And as I am speaking, I am very hopeful the internet will continue to work because there's actually a fair amount of wind outside and some wires going down because of this tropical storm that's going by right now. So quite a topical issue if my video feed does cut out for some reason. Before we dive into those three things, I want to spend a couple of minutes just connecting the big picture on COVID-19 and climate change and how we think about these things. All of you have spent some time in science class on some level or another. And so you're familiar with the idea of problems that have an actual quantitative answer. There is some number of people that get sick. There is some number of degrees of warming that happens. So these are things where there's a clear actual outcome that can be measured. This is not something that can be talked out of existence. Both COVID-19 and the much longer term issues around climate change are inherently fairly simple to understand. One is a disease, one is things getting warmer. And you can talk a little bit about how that happens. But in practice, the way that these affect people's lives are incredibly complicated and are things that happen to people in different ways depending on who you are, where you are, and what your life has been up to this point. It's important to also think about how we are reacting to these things. So all of us have probably tried to recycle or not do things that emit lots of carbon dioxide. Now a lot of us are hopefully wearing face masks. I certainly am wearing one whenever I leave my house. And it's important to highlight that both with climate change and COVID-19, these are big picture problems where the solution lies in a combination of all of us doing the right thing and taking personal steps that affect what we do day to day, and big picture challenges for government and for bigger leaders on setting policy. In addition, both of these are a pretty clear threat to human well-being, human happiness, human life, but not equally. And so there are people whose experience of climate change already has been extraordinarily upsetting. And there are people clearly all around us who have been affected very, very intensely by COVID-19. And there are other people who have barely felt the effects at all, even though we all live on the same planet. And so we need to think a little bit about why that is and how we all can take effective action to address these things while recognizing that people's experience of them is very different. So that, I think, is our big challenge to think about as we go through a couple of other more detailed topics here. The other theme, which it sounds like you were starting to address in, I call those GIFs, that excellent map of mosquito habitat, is the difference between cause and effect. If I drop a glass of water on the ground, I am immediately embarrassed and upset and have to clean up the water off the floor. If I take a flight on an airliner today, that carbon winds up in the atmosphere and has effects for decades. If I spend a day at a party with no mask on with a lot of people in the middle of a pandemic, I might not get sick for a couple of weeks. People I live with would not get sick for maybe another week or two after that. And so for both climate change and COVID-19, we are dealing with problems where there is a delay between what we do and the effect that it has. And this can be really hard for people to wrap their brains around. That cause and effect, we like to see that. We like immediate results. I'm an ER doctor. I do things that matter on a scale of minutes to hours. And so it takes a really different approach for all of us to deal with things where we take actions and don't see the results for a long time. And so that's the other big underpinning I want to have us all think about with these issues. Now, I think it's important for us to start by talking about who is at risk. I think we can all agree that everyone is somewhat at risk. All of us could get infected with COVID-19. All of us could be affected in various ways by climate change, whether it's by reading about it in the news or whether it's by getting hit by a huge hurricane or something in between. And the hazards vary by location. But one of the things that has been talked about a lot in the climate change literature and in the groups of people that are trying to figure out policies to deal with climate change, which is now happening, is that some people are going to be affected a lot more than others. And I'm currently talking to you from Boston, where there's a tropical storm going by, but the wind is starting to die down. I'm in a safe house. I have a stable internet connection so far, and I'm going to probably be okay. And this same storm 3 days ago looked a lot scarier for a different group of people elsewhere in the same country. If I didn't have a nice house that I was in, I would be at higher risk. if I didn't have people who were going to check on me and make sure I was okay. I would be at higher risk. And so there are certain ways that we live, and those are often not our fault or not because of something we did, but are just facts of whatever life we are living that affect how dangerous different things can be. And during this pandemic, I think we have all started to see in a particularly intense way that risk is not distributed equally in this country or around the world. During the pandemic, we have seen that people who live in places with a lot of other people around them are more at risk of being around other people, and that's how you get sick. We've seen that people who work jobs where they have to show up to work in person and interact with other people are at much greater risk of getting sick. And that's not fair, but that's how it is. And if you look at this on a big picture level, you start to see some populations and some individuals that are at high risk, both from climate change and from COVID-19. One group of people is people with chronic lung disease. So if you have asthma, if you have emphysema or COPD because you smoked cigarettes for a long time, that makes it harder for your lungs to function. It makes it harder for you to breathe. And that makes you more likely to get sick when there's a heat wave or a hurricane or some other airborne issue during a climate change related thing. It also makes you a lot more likely to get severely ill from COVID-19. So that's a shared set of risks. A second piece is race. And there's a long and complicated and really difficult history in this country and elsewhere around who lives where, who's rich, who's poor, who has good air quality, who doesn't. And the way that that has broken down in the United States is that minority communities, particularly Black communities, have been at much higher risk, both from urban heat waves and air pollution, even before the COVID-19 pandemic. And now that is combining with the COVID-19 pandemic to produce a measurably higher risk of infection and a measurably higher fatality rate during this pandemic. And if we start trying to tease apart the why of that, we get into a much longer talk than I can give today that would draw on people with a lot of expertise different from mine. But what we have seen clinically is that asthma rates, particularly in Black communities that live near highways or fossil fuel plants or other sources of air pollution, have higher rates of asthma, particularly in kids. And a lot of the people living in those communities work essential jobs for the function of our society where they can't just stay home and hide from the virus. And so people have been having to get out of their houses and more at risk of getting sick at the same time that they're in a community where there's a lot more people who would be vulnerable to the virus. And so when I look at maps in my public health work, looking at which communities around Boston are at risk from heat and which communities are at risk from asthma and from air pollution and who's at risk from COVID-19 and where we've seen a lot of COVID-19 cases, those maps all look pretty much the same. And so there are some bigger questions there that are not just about COVID-19 or not even just about climate change, but are about why are we allowing some people in our country to be affected in this way? And what can we do about it? And I would argue there's a lot we can do about it, and we should not let it continue this way. A couple of the things to think about, which again, I'm going to mention a few things that hopefully you can spend some time reading about or learning about on your own. One is community-based resilience. This is people who are in a place where things are higher risk or maybe not going so well, taking steps, sometimes in partnership with local government or with nonprofit organizations, to help each other. And this can be a really effective way to use a limited amount of money and a lot of energy from people who care about their neighbors to make sure everybody's okay. Examples of this include in New York City, in some neighborhoods where historically a lot of people have been left at home alone during heat waves and can get really sick or die from that. They now have programs where people can check on their neighbors, and you have a list of phone numbers to call grandma who lives upstairs that you only see occasionally in the hallway, but today is the day to make sure she's okay. So that's an example of something that people in a community can do for themselves. Other things that can happen at a higher level, there's obviously a huge amount of government policy work that can help keep people safe. That depends on your government. And so there's a lot that goes into the politics and voting and what you see as your value set for that. I think big picture, it's worth thinking about this as two separate things. So if you have a group of people that's at higher risk and we're in the middle of a pandemic, well, we should be doing some stuff right now. We should be taking steps to make sure there's safe childcare options. We should be making sure that people have, if they need a place to self-isolate, have a place to go to have COVID-19 and get well so they don't expose their families. And these are things that we can do. A lot of the patients I saw at the field hospital I worked at were doing okay medically, but did not want to go home to a family that had not been infected because they were going to get them sick if they did. And so we gave them a place to stay on a couple liters of oxygen and get well. And that by itself did a lot to help some of these communities. So there's a lot that can be done there. So there's short-term stuff. The other piece is long-term, and it's addressing the structural causes of some communities, for example, minorities in the United States, being long-term at higher risk from a variety of different hazards, whether it's a pandemic or climate change, and taking steps as a society to change that. I want to shift gears a little bit to talk about climate disasters. And I'll be happy to answer questions about anything that I've glossed over too quickly here, because there's a lot of complexity in the stuff we're talking about. So disasters. These make the front page of the newspaper, and yet we often don't hear the full story or really understand what happened. In my work prior to the COVID-19 pandemic and continuing during it, I am looking at the effects that hurricanes, heat waves, and other climate change related natural disasters can have on people. And this doesn't just mean that a hurricane happened and a tree fell on your car. It's looking at things like if a hurricane happens and your primary care clinic is shut down for a month and you can't get your insulin refilled, what happens? And it turns out there are some pretty long-term effects lasting for months after some of these storms that don't always make it into the media and may be symptoms of people having a really hard time navigating an altered healthcare system, an altered job environment, and a sometimes pretty complicated response to the disaster. So the added layer now is that COVID-19 is a disease that is transmitted from person to person if you're in enclosed spaces together. The traditional model to dealing with a disaster, say there's a wildfire, you leave your house to get away from the fire and you go somewhere. And for a lot of people, that somewhere is a shelter. And these are run by the American Red Cross or by the federal government or by state and local agencies. And these are often a high school gym or a senior center that's been converted or some other large building where you can go and be for a few days while the fire gets under control and then go home to your house. And if your house has burned down, well, then you're going to be in the shelter for a while you get things sorted out. So that's how things have been handled in the past. Now, going to a shelter sounds kind of scary because you don't know who else is going to be in the shelter. And if you get a whole lot of people together in one room, that seems like a pretty dangerous place in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. You don't know who's sick. Some people who are sick don't have symptoms. Not everyone can be convinced to wear a mask, and there probably isn't enough testing to test everyone every day in a shelter. And in the initial data that I've been looking at, we are indeed seeing that during the handful of climate-related natural disasters we have seen this year, far fewer people are going to shelters. And there have been some newspaper reports indicating people are like sleeping in their cars in the shelter parking lot or are just not evacuating, which during a minor hurricane, kind of like what's going on outside my window here, which is sort of some wind and some rain with some power lines down, most people will be okay at home. But in a big hurricane where there's a 5-foot flood in the streets, that can be a really big problem, and a lot of people should still evacuate. And so one of the challenges this summer and this fall is figuring out what to do with that. The Red Cross and the National Shelter System have started opening smaller shelters for fewer people, less than 50 people in one place, to allow for some degree of social distancing. And there is some attempt at messaging around, you still need to evacuate, you still need to take these hurricanes and fires seriously, and yet still be safe from COVID-19, even if you're going to stay in a hotel or stay with family somewhere, and what you can do to try and stay safe in terms of wearing a mask, not sharing bathrooms, things like that. So there is stuff being done, but it's a complicated situation. There will be more of this year. We've had a few hurricanes this week, and I can only imagine that by the time we are done with this hurricane season, we will have seen some much bigger storms affecting the United States. And so particularly if you're in a place where those may happen, figuring out what your plan is now for a place you can safely go if you need to evacuate is a really good idea. I want to also talk a little bit toward the end here about the intersection of climate change solutions and solutions to COVID-19 or to preventing future pandemics. As you were probably seeing before I got here, there's a lot of links between the environment and human health. Some of that is mosquito-borne disease, some of that is a really hot day and the effects that can have on your body. With climate change and with COVID-19, there are a few things that really line up. One of these is how pandemics happen. So viruses and bacteria are everywhere, but we usually see pandemics coming from contact between people and animals. And it's often animals that live in the wild, where there are viruses that just haven't made it into the human population yet that turn out to be really bad. And on average, I think there's 1 or 2 a year where some degree of human transmissibility of something new from wildlife can happen. And if you think about when that happens, it requires interaction between humans and animals, which means either people need to go to where the animals are, or wild animals need to come to where the people are. And we can trace a couple of ways that this happens. So in terms of people going toward animals, by far the most common scenario is that expanding populations in various places, particularly in the tropics where there's more biodiversity per square mile, as a population expands, people cut down forests, build farms, build factories, and move into places that used to be natural. And that can result in interacting with bats and armadillos and pangolins and all kinds of other creatures that have been brought up in the news in recent months with various theories about how COVID-19 or Ebola or other diseases have started. So that's a really common one. A second scenario in which people can get into the place where the animals belong is going into remote areas to drill for oil or natural gas, which can involve cutting into rainforest and drilling wells and contact between people and animals in that way as well. Both of these are important to highlight because deforestation and extraction of fossil fuels like oil and gas, those are 2 of the biggest reasons climate change is moving forward so quickly. And so cutting back on the oil and gas exploration and reducing the rate of deforestation, reducing that will help forests keep carbon and pull carbon out of the air and will prevent us from burning fossil fuels that are still in the ground. The other side of this coin is how do animals get to where people are? And one of those is the trade in illegal wildlife. So these can be as pets or as food. And there's a huge international trade in smuggling often endangered species. And that obviously carries a lot of risk in terms of new diseases getting out into the population. And is something that is clearly harmful to the ecosystems that are trying to keep the planet in balance. So addressing that is a big piece of this. The other piece that's worth talking about is climate change is changing the ecosystem. You saw that map of mosquitoes where that big red area around the equator kept expanding northwards. That same thing is happening for a whole lot of other insects, plants, animals. And as those changes happen, they get into new places. So you can get malaria in a new place where it didn't exist before, for example. You can also get things like plague outbreaks and hantavirus outbreaks when rodent populations that have been living in colonies in the wild run out of food and water and start looking for survival options in other locations, which might be nearby human settlements. And that's just actually been documented in Madagascar and Central America and Central Asia. And as climate change happens, we're probably going to see more episodes where local climate abruptly changes and causes wildlife to move. And that's another potential risk point for pandemics to happen. So the solutions to this largely focus on specific policies that address both of these things. So addressing trade in wildlife, whether for food or as pets, addressing deforestation, which is an incredibly complicated issue because that's also related to poverty in a number of countries with rapidly expanding populations. And finally, addressing the extraction of oil and gas and where we're doing that and why. So we can also hope that we can do a lot of this stuff. Much of what I'm describing requires cooperation between different governments or significant effort by big organizations. But I think as I sort of close for this and get ready to take a couple of questions, the big picture is that there is a lot we can do. And whether that's at an individual level by making decisions in your life that are safe for the people around you, wear your mask, recycle your cans, try not to fly on jets, both because that burns carbon and it goes into the atmosphere, and also because that's kind of a good way to spread diseases right now. Minimizing air travel is a big piece. There's individual things we can do. There are local things we can do with nonprofits or maybe the person down the street from you. And there's a lot that can be done by the state governments, the federal governments, and cooperation between different governments. And if you're interested in that, again, that's a bigger topic than I can get into today, but there's a lot that you can do that will affect what happens. So I think there's hope, there's a lot of hope, but it requires action and it requires getting involved with things and learning about them. So I thank you all for taking the time to listen to what I've got to say and to also learn about what's going on, because that's the first step in addressing what's going on, which is something that we urgently need to do on both of these issues. So thank you all. I can take some questions. I can hand it back to you, Isha.
Yeah, definitely. Students, if you have any questions, you can always just mention it in the chat or raise your hand and ask it directly. One of the students directly messaged me to ask you this, Dr. Dresser, but they were just curious more about this community kind of resilience plan that you mentioned, and they wanted you to talk a little bit more about what that would actually look like in a community.
Totally. That's a great question, and it really depends on the community. There is a whole branch of work that has mostly happened in less developed countries called community-based action research, which involves pairing people with some degree of expertise in something, agriculture, economics, with people who live in a specific place. And then rather than showing up and saying, hi, I'm an economist and I think you should do this, you instead show up and say, hey, let's talk about what's going on and what you're interested in working on. And communities can then go through a process of identifying what they see as the biggest issues in their community, while connected to people that can help them get resources to address those. So that's one model that has been fairly successful in some settings, often in less developed country settings. There's starting to be work on doing that in the United States as well, because it is much more respectful of the people who live in a given place than just showing up and saying that you have the answers. So I'm very much in favor of that type of thing. There are also approaches where basically any organization that involves people from a community coming together and doing something enhances community resilience. There was a big heat wave in Chicago in the 1990s where actually hundreds of people died. And most of the people who died were people who lived alone and didn't have anyone who was expected to check on them. And in some communities that were poorer, older, and higher risk medically, death rates were actually a lot lower because there was a sense of community. And that might have come through the neighborhood church. It might have come through extended family social networks. It might have come through a variety of other things. But if that set of connections existed, people survived. And there are a lot of different ways that can play out in different communities. But I think the big takeaway that I can give you right now is if you're in a community and you see some problems, start talking to people around you about what you can do about those. And there are a lot of different models you can use to go from there, but the first step is figuring out who else sees this problem and whether they can work with you on it.
Amazing, thank you so much. We also, Vivian asked this in the chat, but since climate change is such an international issue, how can you pass policy that is enforceable between nations to address the issue?
This is a problem no one has been able to solve for the past 35 years. If you look back at the history of the councils of parties, which is where all the governments of nations come together to come up with plans to address climate change, they have in some cases come up with plans and even come up with sort of self-enforced commitments. But the reality is it's very hard to enforce stuff between nations. And I think there is a lot of hope in that there are a lot of countries that are doing the right thing. But it is challenging, and it is very hard to force a sovereign nation to do something it doesn't want to do. And there are some nations that simply are following their own perceived self-interests on these issues. I tend to think that a long-term assessment of what's in the best interests of a given country would probably lean much more toward addressing climate change if you factor in what's going to happen to crop yields 20 years from now. But in some cases, the politicians involved are not really worried about 20 years from now. They're worried about the next election cycle. And in those settings, it may be hard for this type of issue to come to the fore. Where that leaves us is that a lot of other entities, non-government, can do a lot to address this. And so putting pressure on corporations to sustainably source whatever materials they're using, pushing for energy companies to produce solar energy or wind energy. Those are things that you can do as a consumer or you can leverage towards in various negotiations if you're an organization. And so there are ways to do that. And then there's also the advantage of that in some places, solar power is now far cheaper than oil. And so in some places, this is simply happening because it makes economic sense to move in a greener direction. So there's a lot of hope there, but there are some real structural governance challenges there as well.
I had a quick question just about awareness about, so I know COVID-19 and climate change, people only started caring about these issues once they reached like extreme severity. So how do you think, I know like obviously science and policy is super important, but how do we like convince policymakers or the general public that these are issues that have to be tackled right now instead of like 20 years into the future?
That is a very, very good question. I don't know for sure. Here is my thought. If you look at what happened with COVID-19, each place that it has cropped up didn't totally react preventively. Basically, most places have reacted once it was clear that it was a problem there, in a variety of different locations all over the world. And so I think you're very spot on with that there needs to be media attention and a pretty clear sense that this is a clear present danger that is happening right now in order to motivate some people to take action. I think for COVID-19, it is now pretty clear that this is a big problem. And I will not get into the politics of what's happening there. I will simply say that there is a clear medical and public health answer to what we should be doing. In terms of the climate change angle, it's a really delayed system. With COVID-19, it takes a few weeks to see that you made a mistake in your policy and that case counts are now going up. With climate change, it takes decades. And we are currently experiencing the effects of carbon that was emitted in the 1990s that's still up there in the atmosphere. And carbon we're emitting right now will affect us tomorrow, but will also affect us in 30 years. And so I think for making that real, it is very important to make it real in the individual personal lives of the people you're trying to reach. I think graphs are only scary if you're interested in graphs. I think projections of 30 years from now are only scary if you're thinking about 30 years from now. And I think it's often much more convincing to people to be presented with information such as, hey, I see that you have these 2 medical conditions and you live in this location, which means your personal health is at risk now from these things. And you don't have to have a hurricane to have that person be aware that they live in a flood zone that would be a problem if there was a hurricane. So that's one way to make it personal. Another way that has had some success with COVID-19 is like, think about your family members. If you don't want to wear that mask, well, wear it for grandma, because she's going to have a really bad day if you give her COVID-19. If you don't want to address climate change yourself, well, what about your kids? Are they going to want to deal with this? And there has actually been some research done on changing the opinions of people about climate change that found that children were actually the most effective communicators when compared with media and textbooks and TV and politicians. None of those people were anywhere near as effective as having your kid come up to you and say, hey, Dad, what are we doing about climate change? I'm worried. This feels like it's going to affect me. And so I think there's a lot that young people can do to help affect the discourse on this now.
Thank you.
Of course.
Vivian also had another question in the chat, which related more to minority communities. So she asked, because you talked about how minority communities, especially Black communities, live in areas where they're at higher risk for climate change or disease, what kind of policy do you think can be created to address something like this?
Yeah, so Vivian, this is a really good question. And if you come up with a perfect solution, email me and we will help you put it into action. The reality is it's a really tough problem. Moving communities is extraordinarily expensive and often really harmful. Like, you uproot people from the place that they live. There's a whole lot of community and culture and sense of place and connections with other people that is lost when you do that. So that's probably not the answer in most cases. I think there are things we can do. One example is living near highways. So there's been a whole lot of research in the last couple of years looking at air pollution from cars and trucks, which has showed that living within a certain distance of a big highway, say a mile, is associated with a measurable increase in risk of stroke, heart attack, asthma, and some other medical problems. And these are the types of things that are certainly happening in communities, such as some of the ones down the road from me here in Boston that are right next to highways and have very high minority populations. So one way to address that is to get some electric cars on those roads and remove the air pollution issue. So that's an example where addressing a root cause of climate change, which is carbon emissions from cars, would also fix an immediate air pollution issue today in a way that is targeted to maximally benefit communities that are already at the highest risk. So that's an example of something really constructive that is also doable. The technology exists for that right now. There are a lot of other things to talk about as well, but that's one example.
One of the questions we had earlier when we were talking about kind of air quality and how that relates to human health, one of the students wanted to know a little bit more about, at least from a doctor's perspective, how ozone kind of affects people who have respiratory issues.
Yeah, so ozone is a lung irritant. It's important to understand that ozone is a type of oxygen molecule. And there are two types of ozone to know about. One of them is ozone way up in the atmosphere. And this is the ozone that prevents bad sunlight, ultraviolet sunlight, from coming down and giving us sunburns. And so the ozone layer and the hole in the ozone layer, if you've heard about those are ozone up way up in the atmosphere. The other place ozone can be is right down by the ground. And I think that's what this person is asking about, which is ozone usually emitted by burning things in engines or certain industrial processes that sticks around in the valleys in California during smog events, for example. And ozone definitely irritates your lungs and is associated with a measurable increase in hospitalizations for lung-related diseases when levels go up. So it's definitely an air quality problem. It's one that we can address. And it's one that's potentially going to get worse as we have more burning of fossil fuels and more heat, because heat and ozone tend to interact to particularly irritate people's lungs. Any other questions?
I guess I have one more question. So it sounds like the world probably isn't in like the best state right now, but what are some like individual things that we as like students could do to like maybe make a change and like support any initiatives that are addressing these issues?
Yeah, I think there's a lot you can do. I think there are two big pieces. One of those is live your life well. And by that, I mean, do the things that are in your control that address these issues. So wearing your mask with COVID-19, talking to all of your friends and family about these issues in a convincing way, acting within your life in the most constructive way possible. And if everyone was doing that, we would be in a really good place. The second thing you can do is find something to work on. And I think there is risk when you spend a lot of time reading about terrible things or learning about terrible things of becoming overwhelmed. And one of the solutions to that is to be aware of all of these things and then find something you can address. And for some people, that will be working on advocating for a specific piece of legislation and getting really into that policy and advocacy piece. For others, it might be figuring out how to address the risk of flooding in their community, which might involve some climate change stuff or might really involve an engineering project where you need to raise some money to build an earth wall. And so finding actionable projects that you can work on will totally depend on who you are and what you're interested in, what your talents are, how you like to interact with the world around you. But finding something that you can do and produce results on is going to be way more satisfying and do more for the world than worrying about a lot of things while not doing anything at all. And so I would say find something you can do and succeed at. And once you've done that, do it again.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Dresser. I think those are all of the questions that students had based on kind of what you presented.
Okay. It was nice to meet you all. Good luck with everything. Stay safe.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Dresser.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, so does anyone have any other questions kind of about what we talked about in general? Also, one of the things we didn't really have time to do today, but we have a couple of videos that a professor sent to us saying that they want to share with you. And it's basically just explaining the link between COVID-19 and global warming, but more in a visual way. So I'm going to be sending that in the chat as well, in the case that you find those helpful. But yes, feel free to check those out. Okay, and also I know that kind of we talked about this towards the end with Ryan's question about what can individual things, what do individual things each of us do, what does that look like? So I think that all of the things we've been talking about so far have been a little bit depressing. Like it's hard to hear about, you know, the state of the pandemic with so many people dying, as well as kind of learning about the way our planet is dying as well. So instead of leaving on a sad note, we think it'd be helpful if we all had a discussion as to little things that we can do in our everyday lives, about how we can maybe stop the progression of both the pandemic or climate change in general. So we can think about it for a couple of seconds, but I would love if every one of us could share something either in the chat, or you can honestly unmute yourself and kind of just share something, but that would be really nice. And just to kind of, while everyone is thinking, just to recap, I know a couple of you just joined us at 4. So just to recap what we talked about with Dr. Dresser, we throughout this session really talked about kind of global warming in a vacuum, but also how things like the environment affect us as humans, whether it means decreased crop yield, so less food to eat, the air quality is bad, which means it's harder for us to breathe. Ryan gave us a really cool example of kind of these bacteria or pathogens being released from ice when the ice melts because the earth is warmer. So a lot of these examples, and Dr. Dresser really shared with us kind of how climate change specifically affects the COVID-19 pandemic and how some communities are really being hurt by both the pandemic as well as climate change. So that's kind of like a brief recap of what we did overall. But yeah, I would love to hear what like individual thoughts people would have, because I know it can be really hard to think about the state of the world and it can be depressing, but there are little things that all of us can kind of commit to doing.
I can go first.
Sure.
So when I go back to school this fall, I will be wearing a mask, obviously, to keep everyone safe. And then one of my personal goals is to buy like secondhand clothes, or just buy less clothes in general, because a lot of the clothing companies like H&M, Zara, they make a lot of clothes at once, but like because they're making so many clothes, it's just super wasteful and they pollute like these are big polluters, so I'm gonna buy less from these stores.
Very cool. Lena mentioned this in the chat, but she said we can utilize other forms of transportation like bikes and scooters instead of using cars to travel. That's a great example. So even little things like carpooling, or like Vivian mentioned, using public transport, that's super important, because if you remember from that graph, I think it was like 28% of kind of these greenhouse gases come from things like transportation. So if we're able to cut that down, that means that the number of greenhouse gases also go down. So those are some great examples. Akshara mentioned wearing a mask, recycling, also some great things. Everyone should recycle, like that blue recycling bin. Sometimes people will put trash in there. Don't do that. Learn the difference between what should be put in a recycling bin and what should be put in your regular trash can, because that is really important. What other thoughts do people have? And you can feel free to repeat things, but what are things you think in your life can be very doable? Yeah, so Krishna mentioned in the chat, not waste things. So Krishna, do you want to maybe elaborate on what that means?
Like, don't waste like what I mean is like sometimes people they just like they take something and then like they just throw it out, and like cause like if you put it in the recycle, you kind of reuse it also. Like first of all, many people don't even follow the rules of recycling and trash cans. Like they just put it away. And second of all, since they don't follow that, they're wasting more things. And like if you waste more things, then you have to, like, for example, for paper, you have to cut down more trees, and like it hurts the environment. So that's why like I want to like save stuff.
Yeah, that's a really great example, Krishna. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, even things like for paper, oftentimes when you have, for example, like sometimes you print things on one side, you can maybe print things on both sides, or you can use the back side of paper to write. You can use like scratch paper, just because, yeah, otherwise we're cutting down trees, and trees are the habitats for so many animals, and they produce oxygen for, our environment. How about we can take a couple more examples? Yes, I see, like, don't use plastic straws. That's a great example. Like, I'm not sure if you guys have seen this, but there's lots of people who have like a metal straw and they carry that around with them all the time. So you can just like wash it so you're not like throwing away or using plastic. Oh, Hagios, you have a metal straw. That is awesome. Yeah, little things like that are examples of kind of what we can do. Hagios also mentioned that we shouldn't waste food. That's a great example, especially with what we kind of talked about today in terms of food insecurity. Like, because we know that there is going to be decreased crop yields, we should not waste the food. Yeah. Have you guys, there's this really cool nonprofit, I'm forgetting the name, but lots of times there's like vegetables or produce that don't like look very good. I don't know if you guys like understand what I'm saying, but sometimes you go to the supermarket and there are some vegetables that like look really pretty and some that just like look kind of deformed, but they're still really good to eat. Like there's nothing wrong with them. They just don't look like the prettiest vegetable. And sometimes those vegetables and fruits, like those produce, aren't bought and they're wasted. So this nonprofit buys those vegetables and then sells them at cheaper cost, I think, just so that they can make sure that those vegetables and those produce aren't wasted and they don't end up in landfills. And that's a really cool thing that kind of different organizations are also doing. Oh, Eric, you also have a metal straw? That is very cool. Akshara also mentioned this earlier, but planting trees or doing things that you would do on Earth Day. Yeah, I know, like Earth Day is such a big deal and we always like we always do things on Earth Day, but trying to do those things every day is always super helpful. Yeah. Those are some great examples, and hopefully next time we can maybe hear how people have made progress on the different things we talked about today. But with that, does anyone have any questions before we call it a day? Okay, amazing. And also for those of you who might have missed the earlier session, don't worry, we recorded it, so we will be sending out the recording, so you can always catch up, and if you have questions, you can always just ask us in the next session. But with that, thank you so much everyone for coming today. We're super, super excited for seeing all of you next week.
Thank you.
See you next week.
Bye guys, take care.
Thank you, bye.
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 Bye.